for modern living. I'm your host, Secular Gerson-Miller. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and certified yoga therapist in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also a mom of 2 kids. I don't know if I've shared that before, but I like to describe myself as a mom, a yogi. I'm a vegetarian. There's a lot of different things that I could share about me. But most of all, I feel like I'm a person who just tries to live life on life's terms, which, as we all know, isn't easy at all. For those of you that are new around here, I'm really happy that you're here. I appreciate you being here. And I just wanted to, let you know a little bit about the podcast. It's really dedicated to promoting and supporting mental health in all stages, from simple awareness to recovery. And we do that through practical yoga, lifestyle, and spiritual growth. So here we explore a lot of intersecting places between mental health, practical yogic lifestyle tips, and other psychological concepts and ideas that are rooted in Eastern traditions. So I think you'll find a lot of really useful information here, everything from some of the deeper teachings of yoga. We talk about meditation, mindfulness, holistic lifestyle, nutrition, anything that can help support a person who is struggling with a mental health challenge. Now, with that said, there's a lot of controversy over what we label, like how do we name a mental health challenge? I prefer to use mental health challenge versus mental health illness or disease or disorder. I think those are a little bit more pejorative, and I think challenge just suggests that yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Sometimes there are symptoms. Sometimes there are an absence of symptoms. It's sort of this wave that we ride at times, and then other times it's kind of calm and peaceful. So symptoms oftentimes are transient. They're not always, they're definitely not permanent, but they come and go. And so some days are going to be better than others. And when you live with a mental health challenge, it's like any other condition. You have to learn how to manage it. And what works for one person isn't going to work for everyone. And so here I like to try to, just reiterate that depending on the severity of your symptoms, you might need to be talking to a psychiatrist. You might even need to be on medication. Medication isn't going to work for everybody, but I don't think that we need to rule it out completely. And a lot of the times, yoga isn't the complete end-all answer either. So I really think that when we're dealing with mental health, we have to look at it from a holistic perspective, that maybe it's a combination of several things that you use, and everybody's way of managing it is going to be different. So I think if you're a person who has a mental health challenge, or you live with somebody, or you know somebody, or you love somebody, or you work with somebody who struggles with mental health, I think you're in the right place. I think you're going to get a lot of useful information here. So with that said, I would love to introduce my guest today. His name is Noah Rasheta, and he is the founder and facilitator of the Secular Buddhism Podcast. I came across his podcast a couple of years ago because it is so accessible. I really have found that many of the concepts and teachings that are found in the Buddhist tradition are very applicable to modern day living. I think they're very simple when they're explained in a certain way, and I think that they're so easy to integrate. They're very simple, they're very universal. That's really what I love about them. And Noah is such a wonderful facilitator and speaker on this topic. So I reached out to him, and he reached back out to me, and we were able to schedule this interview. He is a Buddhist teacher. He's a lay minister and author, as well as the host of the podcast Secular Buddhism. He teaches mindfulness and Buddhist philosophy online and in workshops all over the world. He works with others to make the world a better place as he studies, embodies, and teaches the fundamentals of Buddhist philosophy, integrating Buddhist teachings with modern science, humanism, and humor. He lives in Utah with his wife and 3 kids. So today we're going to be talking about the intersection of some of these teachings and how they can help somebody who lives with mental health challenges to live a fuller and more just peaceful life. So without further ado, here is my interview. Well, hi, Noah. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So could you share with our listeners a little bit about your background? So how did you arrive at a place that inspired you to create the Secular Buddhist Podcast and the Foundation for Mindful Living?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So it started around 2010, summer of 2010. I was going through a difficult phase in life. I was on the brink of possible failed marriage, moving from one state to another, looking for a job. Several things had kind of built up at the same time. And I was just looking for peace, I think, and trying to sort things out. And I was in that mindset of exploration. And I had heard about meditation, and I think everyone kind of knows meditation is one of those things that's supposed to help you be able to have peace during difficult times in life. And I think that was maybe the initial catalyst for me to start looking into what is meditation, why do people do it, how does it work? And I started attending various religious seminars. So at the time I was, my background, it was being raised LDS, Mormon, and Christian. It wasn't working for me for some reason, and I was still looking for something else. So I started attending religious seminars, and a world religions seminar that talked about like the meaning of life as presented from the 5 major world religions, and it goes through each one. And the last module was on Buddhism, and what stood out to me was the approach. By the time I got to Buddhism, it was like, well, rather than having answers to these existential questions, Buddhism kind of flips it and says, who wants to know, or why do you want to know? And that really piqued my interest and my curiosity, because I was like, well, I kind of wanted the answer. So I thought, well, I want to look into this a little bit more. How does this work? So I started reading more about Buddhism and reading about mindfulness, and started practicing meditation. And the more I learned, the more peace I started to feel with whatever was going on. At the time, things, like I mentioned, were kind of difficult, but it was okay. And the more time I spent with it, the more convinced I became that meditation actually works, and you can have peace and contentment and joy amid the chaos that may be going on in life. And so it came at the right time. And once I navigated through the whole thing, I was very interested in sharing that with others, because people in my inner circle who knew what was going on in family life and my religious transition as well, they were like, well, why are you calm and peaceful about everything that's going on? And I was like, well, I've been meditating and I've been learning about these concepts. And I started explaining stuff to them, and that just continued, like, well, then what about this and what about that? So the ongoing questions and answers got me thinking it would be cool to explain everything I've learned in a format that would be easy for somebody who has no experience or knowledge about Buddhism or about mindfulness to learn about what this stuff is and how it works and how you do it and what happens when you do it. So that's where the idea for the podcast came about.
I see. And so now I think I heard you mention in one of your episodes that you are an ordained Buddhist leader, or Did I hear that right on one of your podcast episodes, or am I making stuff up right now?
No, you heard that right.
Okay.
So several years into that process, I decided to, I had been doing a lot of self-studying. And after, I want to say 2 years of just devouring every book I could get my hands on about Buddhism, I thought, I want to train formally, and I want to learn this a more structured and formal setting. So I enrolled in a ministry program. It was a 2-year program, and I graduated from that earlier this year. So that process allowed me to become an ordained minister and to be able to actually officiate at weddings or things like that. So that was, the goal of that was just to deepen my personal understanding and my practice. But as a result of that, I did end up, formally becoming a minister, a Buddhist minister.
I see. Congratulations on that accomplishment.
Thank you.
So can you define the term secular Buddhism for our listeners?
Yes. So early on, when I started studying Buddhism, as I kind of mentioned, I was going through a faith transition. And at the time, I was not interested in any other ism. I was leaving an ism, and I felt like the answer wasn't to find another platform to replace the previous platform. Along with studying Buddhism and mindfulness, I was studying a lot of secular stuff, science, a lot of the new atheists and their books. So when I started to approach Buddhism, I was very careful I didn't want to get entangled in anything dogmatic. And to my surprise, I was finding that by its nature, it's not dogmatic. But there was a movement within Buddhism where some authors, Stephen Batchelor is a prominent author who was a former Buddhist monk, and he wrote a book called Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist, and another book called Buddhism Without Beliefs. That was very influential in my understanding of Buddhism and realizing you can practice it as a psychology, as a way of life, as a philosophy, and not have any of the religious trappings. None of it had to feel ritualistic or religious in any way. So I knew early on as I was studying that I liked the secular approach. And it was important for me to clarify that because in the religious community where I live, as I was kind of transitioning in my own faith, I had to be very cautious to not make it seem like I'm leaving for another religion. So I would always tell people it's secular Buddhism, it's non-religious Buddhism, so it wouldn't threaten the religion I was still a part of at the time. So that was important for me, and I bought the domain name secularbuddhism.com, and so I wanted to present everything in that secular format. Now, over time, especially as I've become more involved with Buddhism in general, I've realized that explaining Buddhism through a secular lens is very much like communicating love through one of the love languages, right? It's not to say that this certain way of expressing love is better or more authentic than this other way. If you're familiar with the 5 love languages, you'll know that there's just different ways of expressing the same thing. And I felt like secular Buddhism is just a voice within Buddhism that expresses the concepts from a more philosophical standpoint and isn't concerned with anything that seems religious. And there's a big demand for that. A lot of people like me who were disaffected with their former belief system were not interested in feeling like they were replacing it or finding something new. So the term really appealed to them. So that's a big part of why I call it secular Buddhism.
Well, it sounds like it's much more inclusive that way and welcoming. That you can sort of be where you are in whatever spiritual, path you're on and still be able to apply some of the concepts to, wherever you are in life. And I think that is a thing that people rub up against a lot, is this black and white thinking that it either has to be this or that, that you can't be both. I know I've gotten into conversations with people about that and, have discovered that when there's that, kind of fundamental belief system, it just doesn't feel like a safe place for me to be, So that idea of plurality, I think, is so beautiful, and I think it's kind of where we're at today in our modern contemporary society. We're all so many different things.
Right.
Yeah. So, the goal and vision of this podcast for me is to present ideas, strategies, and solutions to help us face the challenges we all encounter in modern day living based on the teachings and practices of ancient wisdom traditions. And I say that, because I'm a licensed psychotherapist. And so I, work with people who have a variety of both mental health and physical health challenges. So what kinds of modern day challenges do you encounter in your own life in which Buddhist teachings have helped you to navigate more effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say for me, one of the most impactful teachings that I've encountered in Buddhism is the teaching of no self or not self. And the idea behind this teaching is that we have the tendency to identify with elements of ourselves, like our feelings, the labels we give ourselves, and then we start to see that as who we are, rather than recognizing that there is no permanent you. There's just the you that you are now. It's like the Snickers commercial that says you're not you when you're hungry.
Right.
Well, the implication of that, which is actually quite profound, is that you can't be the you that's you when you're hungry is not the you that you always are, right? Because as soon as you satisfy that hunger, now you're a different you. But the satisfied you is also not permanent, right? Because you'll be hungry again. So the dilemma with that is that, well, then which you are you? The hungry you or the non-hungry you? But you can extend that out to almost any other you, the tired you, the you that's had coffee, the you that hasn't had coffee in the morning. It's like, where do we draw that line and say, now this is the you that's always you? That teaching was really profound for me because I felt like I had really strong labels that I identified with. For example, being an entrepreneur. I've always had my own business because I've always felt like that's what I do. I was raised that way and taught that you don't work for someone else, you work for yourself. And that was a big part of who I was. So here I am in my adult life and as an entrepreneur. And in recent years, one of the businesses that I had built up that I was really proud of because it had grown so much was facing possible failure. And it was hurting me because of the way I identified with my label of being an entrepreneur. So here I was experiencing a threat to my sense of self, when in reality it's a business is failing. So what? But this was me on the line. This is who I am. And through Buddhism, I was able to recognize that that's what I was doing. And the moment I kind of severed myself from the label, not necessarily in the sense that I'm not that, but recognizing that's just something I do. That's not who I am. So much of that pain and suffering that I was experiencing with the company failing went away. And it's like, well, now it's just a company that's failing, but it's not me that's failing because that's not who I am. I would say, and that's carried on to other labels that I carry, being a dad, being a husband, being a whatever I am. That's something I do. It's not who I am. And that's been a very powerful way of feeling more, allowing myself to feel more contentment and joy with whatever it is I'm going through, because my sense of self is never on the line because I'm not any of my labels.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yes, definitely. I thank you for clarifying that. I think you explained it really eloquently. I know in yoga, we also talk about this idea of the self. There is this constant sense of self that is part of the, just this divine consciousness that we all, that we're all part of. So we're all drops in this big ocean. And, the suffering is often caused by, like you were saying, these all these, these things that we identify with. And then, if I identify myself as an entrepreneur, then with that comes this belief system of what I think a successful entrepreneur looks like. And then that creates even another layer of suffering, because then you're not you're not meeting your own expectations that you have.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But really what does an entrepreneur look like? There are so many different, it's going to depend on so many different variables and factors. So it sounds like it's, there's this sort of like shifting the relationship you have to your beliefs about the way the world is supposed to be or supposed to look.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, there was a Facebook meme going around, and I hope I don't butcher it, but kind of paraphrasing, it says something to the effect of what screws us up the most in life is the picture in our head of how it's supposed to be.
Right.
And I think there's so much truth to that, because there's reality as it is, and then there's the reality that we create, which is the story of how we think it should be. And we do that with things, with others, right? There's who you are, and then there's who I think you should be. But we do that with ourselves, who I am and who I think I should be, and who I think you think I should be. We really start to muddy the waters there, and rarely do we spend time with just reality as it is. And that has been a really fun transition for me to notice that in myself, and to stop the thinking sometimes and just say, well, is this what is, or am I in the conceptual world that I've created? Am I in the story that I've created? And trying to pick apart and see if the suffering has to do with reality or does it have to do with my story?
Right. Yeah. So I love the quote that you include in the beginning of your book. And the title of the book for our listeners is Secular Buddhism for Western Minds. It's a wonderful book that you can purchase on Amazon, and I'm sure on your website as well. In that book, you share one of the Dalai Lama's teachings, and I'm going to quote the Dalai Lama: "Do not try to use what you learn from Buddhism to be a Buddhist. Use it to be a better whatever you already are." And I've also read somewhere that Buddhism is not necessarily a religion, but a science of the mind. So do you ever encounter resistance from others who believe in more fundamental beliefs about faith and religion? And if so, how do you navigate the resistance and help others to see that these teachings are strategies for lifestyle change?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I love that quote. I share it in the book, but I also share it at the beginning of every one of my podcast episodes. And when I go teach workshops, I share it, because I think it's really important to remember that from the Buddhist perspective, the path itself is the goal. So it's not necessary to become a Buddhist, because that's not the goal, right? So by reminding people, hey, you don't have to change. You don't have to change who you are, what you believe. This is about understanding why I think what I think. Why do I say what I say? Why do I do what I do? It's very introspective. And sure, I encounter all the time the fear that someone may have that their beliefs are being threatened by a new ideology. Buddhism as an ideology that competes with their ideology. Unless you study Buddhism, you wouldn't know that Buddhism doesn't really compete with other ideologies. It's kind of unique in the sense that a typical spiritual journey or spiritual path is about getting from point A to point B. And whatever point A is and whatever point B is, could be the world and heaven, right? And the path to get from the world to heaven is this, and this is the only path, and anything that threatens that is dangerous. So it has to do with, anything that threatens getting to the place where you want to get to. Now, Buddhism comes in and it says, well, wait a second. The Buddhist spiritual path isn't about getting from point A to point B. It's about enjoying the path. It's about the path itself. So it doesn't necessarily matter where you're going. It matters, are you enjoying the walk? Because you can, not because you have to. Like you can walk your path, but if you decide you're not happy with your path, then look at that and say, why am I not happy with this? You can remain on that path, remain whatever you are in whatever spiritual tradition you're in, but apply some of these concepts to experience more contentment and peace and joy and gratitude, and stay on your path. You don't have to be on this path over here. when I can explain that to someone, it helps them to no longer feel that threat. Because, again, from the Buddhist perspective, the path itself is the goal. And you don't need to get someone off of their path. You just need to get them to realize, hey, you're on your path. Why are you on the path? What are you doing? Work with the path that you're on. You don't need to be on any other path. That's your path. So there's no threat there. Another way that I sometimes explain this is a lot of spiritual traditions have answers to the existential questions. So if you have an answer that works for you, and I have another answer, there's going to be a sense of threat. Like, well, wait a second, is your answer right or is my answer right? Buddhism doesn't have those answers. Buddhism is concerned with the question. Like I mentioned when I went to that presentation, that's what really stood out to me. So someone who's on a Christian path, for example, like where I live, it's very common to feel like, is this going to be threatening to me? Do those answers compete with my answers? And what they'll find really quickly is it doesn't, because we don't have any answers. You can have all your answers. That's fine. We want you to spend time with a question. Why do I need to know if there's this or if there's that, or whatever the question is? We're about the question. Become more familiar with the question, and you'll become more familiar with yourself. That's the whole point of the Buddhist path. So it doesn't have to compete with any other path.
And I love how you explain that, because I see that come up a lot in psychotherapy, that in my practice, I work with a lot of clients and patients, and, for them, I feel like oftentimes some of our biggest strengths as human beings is our sense of faith and our sense of spirituality. And that comes up a lot for people, especially when they are faced with a really adverse life event or adverse life circumstances or a sudden change. They really draw upon their faith. And another beautiful thing about psychotherapy and any kind of therapeutic process is the expert in the room is the patient, or the expert is in the room is the client. And so I love how this idea of, you're just kind of, well, here's this question, there is no answer, and your own path and journey and life experiences will reveal some kind of truth for you at any stage you're in. And so I think it really allows us to be the experts of our own lives and our stories and our narratives and our suffering as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that's something we're continually trying to emphasize as Buddhist teachers, are trying to help people understand you are your greatest teacher. You are your best friend, but unfortunately, you're also your own worst enemy. So it's your own mind that you want to become very intimate and familiar with, because it's your mind that causes you your happiness or your suffering. But how do we get to that and discover what that is? We can't. Only you can. So that's why it's a very introspective tradition, because it's all about you getting to know you. Right. Not somebody else coming and telling you, here's the deal, here's what you got to do, Right.
Yeah, because then it just gets into prescriptive, and any kind of, the one thing about, I think that all of these ancient teachings have in common is the emphasis on, you are your own healer, you are your own guru. You don't have to, search externally for those answers, because everything you need is already inside of you. So, we're going to talk a little bit about meditation in a minute, because this question comes up a lot, this idea of meditation, and people think that it's just, I can turn my thoughts off. And I tell people, well, the bad news is that, unless you have, no brain activity, that's the only time you're going to be able to turn your thoughts off. The good news, though, is that you can learn to change your relationship to your thoughts. And it's not about turning your thoughts off, because that's the nature of the mind. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about that before you, I hope, can lead us in a bit of a practice. But first, I just wanted to ask you, are there any particular teachings that you think would be helpful for somebody struggling with a mental health challenge or some kind of chronic health condition?
Yeah. So one of the teachings I really enjoy, it's called dependent origination, or I like to call it interdependence. Thich Nhat Hanh calls this interbeing. But the idea is that when we start to understand that all things are interdependent, all things are interconnected, it gives us a lot more power to deal with something. So, for example, in a simple way, the teaching here is Thich Nhat Hanh talks about how if you've ever seen a flower and all you've seen is the flower, then you've never actually seen the flower. And the idea behind that teaching or behind that thinking is that to see the flower, you would have to see the sun, you'd have to see the clouds and the soil, everything that it's taken for that flower to exist the way that it exists. Then that means that flower is interdependent with all those things. So you see the flower, and you see the sun, and you see the rain, and you see the clouds, and you start to see it all, and you realize, well, that it takes everything for this one thing to be. But that's no different with anything else. You look at your kitchen table, the desk that you're sitting at, and what was once just a desk suddenly becomes everything. Like it took everything for this to be here. That teaching has been really powerful when applied to getting introspective with our own thoughts and our emotions and our feelings and our suffering. There's a teaching, a Zen teaching I really like about a kid who comes home upset from school because of something that happened at school. He was called a name or something. And his dad picks up a little stick and starts poking him with it. And he's like, what are you doing? And he just keeps poking with it until the kid is just really upset. And he's like, quit doing that. What are you doing? And he's like, well, what are you mad at? And the kid says, I'm mad at you for poking me with a stick. And he says, I didn't touch you. It's the stick that's touching you. Why aren't you mad at the stick? He's like, well, that would be silly because you're the one holding the stick. And then he goes on and he's like, well, are you mad at my hand for holding the stick? Or are you mad at my arm for moving the hand? Or are you mad at, trying to help him realize, where do you draw that line? And finally he's like, well, I'm just mad at you, your brain. You're the one controlling everything. He's like, well, are you mad at me? Or are you mad at my dad who taught me this lesson? And so at that point, he realizes, where do I draw this line? What if somebody called me something, what caused them to do that? Am I mad at the cause, or am I mad at the cause of the cause, or the cause of the cause of the cause, right? So this is dependent origination. It's that all phenomenon have causes and conditions. Nothing exists in and of itself. So when something happens, an experience, an emotion, a feeling, whatever it is, there are causes and conditions. And there are causes of the causes, right? This goes on and on and on. And that helps us to start to ease the death grip that we have on things like a feeling, right? There's this feeling and I don't like this feeling and I'm just mad at whatever caused that. But rarely do I go further back and realize, well, if I can pinpoint the cause, what's the cause of the cause? At what point do you just let go and say, well, I can't get to the beginning of it all, so there's not a specific thing to be mad at. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
Well, it absolutely makes sense because most of the time people, you have a symptom arise, whether it's a chronic headache or, if you want to look at more profound mental health pathology, somebody becomes psychotic, they have difficulty differentiating between what's real and what's not real. So whatever the symptom is, we usually become really hyper-focused on that symptom and we develop a profound aversion to it. And a lot of the time in our medical system, we're good at treating the symptoms and not necessarily the root cause, but even that root cause has a cause, and that could be a genetic thing that goes back generations,
Yeah.
But are we going to focus on having some sort of revenge on, 6 generations ago, or, where do we want to direct our energy when it comes to just accepting the circumstances as they are and moving forward versus, really getting so focused on that cause that we sort of lose sight of what is helpful and what is going to move us forward. So I think it absolutely helps. Yeah.
And this is one of the areas where meditation really comes in as a tool, because what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to realize is that there's how you feel, and then there's how you feel about how you feel, right? I can feel discomfort with an emotion I'm experiencing, like anger, for example. But then I can be angry that I'm angry, and that's adding a whole new layer of complexity to the emotion. And what a lot of what Buddhism is trying to say is there's nothing wrong with the feeling, the first layer, right? But so much of the suffering we experience is added by us when we have a feeling about the feeling, or even worse, a feeling about the feeling about the feeling, right?
Right.
So we practice through meditation to increase our ability to just sit with discomfort, to become comfortable with discomfort, not to try to change our thoughts, not to try to stop the thoughts, but to watch them, to observe them. And whatever arises, it's just what is. There's no wrong way to feel. There's no wrong way to think, because it's just what you're thinking, or it's just what you're feeling. It's our aversion to it, aversion to the unpleasant feelings and clinging or craving of the pleasant feelings. That's what gets us in trouble. I've got to have more of this and less of that.
Right.
And then we get caught up in this crazy cycle of chasing after things you can't actually have, right? Like the elusive, the happiness trap, thinking if I do this and I avoid that, then I'll be happy and I'll never experience anything other than happiness. And that's just not the nature of reality.
Yeah. And, a lot of people, they will say that, they have this feeling like, whether it's social anxiety or this chronic anger, and it's no longer about the anger. It's about the fact that they are so self-critical when they feel the anger, because they say, well, I shouldn't be angry, or I shouldn't be sad because I have all these wonderful things in my life. Why am I sad? And so asking the question why is already implying that there's something wrong there, and just helping people to kind of see your feeling for what it is, and this idea of non-identification, and that's not who you are. It is a transient sort of, think of it as the weather, here comes some bad weather and it'll rain and then it passes,
Exactly.
and then the sky is still the sky. So,
yeah, exactly.
So speaking of meditation, I would love to have you lead us just in a brief practice that maybe folks can, when they listen to it, that's something that's accessible, that we can do at any time of the day, no matter where we are.
Okay. Yeah, I think the most common form of meditation that's beneficial is increasing our ability to just be aware, to be observers. So I can do a quick guided meditation. Is
that'd
that
be
what
great.
You'd like?
That'd be wonderful.
Okay, so if you're listening to this, feel free to close your eyes or leave them open, whatever you're comfortable with. Unless, of course, you're driving, don't close your eyes. But what we want to practice through this experience is increasing our ability to just be aware. Most often in life, we're making meaning of things. A thought arises, an emotion arises, and we're making meaning of it. Rarely can we sit with something and just observe it. So that's what we're practicing here. So in the same way that you would be sitting out in a field, watching the clouds go by, there are no misshapen clouds. You just see what's there. This is the non-judgmental approach that we want to take to observing our thoughts and our emotions, physical sensations. So we'll start with the senses. Bring awareness to the fact that you're breathing, and see if you can notice the physical sensation of breathing. As you breathe in and as you breathe out, see if you can notice what it feels like to breathe. Perhaps you'll notice a slight temperature fluctuation at the tip of your nose with the in-breath versus the out-breath. Or maybe it's the physical sensation you notice of the rising and the fall in the chest or abdomen area as you breathe. And just bring your awareness and your attention to that spot, one of those two spots, and observe as you breathe in and as you breathe out. And as your mind gets carried away in a thought, bring your awareness back to either the tip of the nose or the rise and fall as you breathe in and out. And the practice is that no matter how many times we get distracted with thought, we come back to the place of awareness. And now see if you can shift your attention from your breathing to your thoughts. And notice how a thought arises, it lingers, and eventually goes away or gets replaced by another thought. In the same way that clouds arise, they linger, and they disappear. And see if you can notice what it feels like to just watch your thoughts. Don't think about the thinking, just observe the thinking. And certain thoughts may invoke certain emotions. And just watch that, observe it. Don't resist, don't try to change, don't try to control. Just watch whatever arises. And as you spend time with observing your thoughts and your emotions and your physical sensations, you'll notice there's less attachment to them. It becomes more about what I feel and less about what I feel about what I feel. More about what physical sensation I'm experiencing and less about the meaning I create around that. And that's a simple exercise that you can do. You can take up, you can pause throughout the day. You can do this when you're walking, when you're washing the dishes, or when you're driving home. At any given moment, you can try to shift into that from thinking mode to observing mode. And what happens when I'm just the observer? And whatever I observe is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong. There's no wrong way to do this. When you're just the observer, you're just seeing what's there. And sometimes it can be as simple as pausing and saying, I'm going to take 10 mindful breaths, and close your eyes and just feel the sensation of breathing in and breathing out 10 times. And that can make a big difference to help us shift from that almost incessant thinking, making meaning mode to just, I'm just here and I'm watching and everything's just the way that it is. What happens when I'm just the observer?
Thank you so much, Noah. I needed that so much right now. You don't even know. Yeah. And I think, what's so beautiful about that is that if we do this consistently and make it an integral practice, then life becomes a meditation. Our lives can absolutely be a meditation and have this meditative quality to them.
Absolutely.
Which is so different from that just dominant cognition, that's always running the show. Because there's so much we miss when we're just in our cognitive functioning. It's just such a one piece of the puzzle. Well, Noah, I am so grateful and appreciative for having the privilege to speak with you today. Can you tell us where we can find you and, tell us about your website and your podcast and your book and all your social media handles? So where can folks find you?
The easiest is just through anything that you search for secular Buddhism. So secularbuddhism.com is my website. If you search for the podcast, it's called Secular Buddhism. You should be able to find that in iTunes or any podcast software. The Facebook group is also just Facebook /Secular Buddhism. And those are the three most common areas where I post and share things. The podcast is roughly every week. It's realistically, though, it's once every couple of weeks. And I explore different topics and I just try to present Buddhist concepts, philosophical concepts, through the secular lens and explain it in a way that makes sense through, what modern psychology and science tell us about how our minds work. And I do this because I genuinely feel like the key to external peace, world peace, if you would say, is internal peace. If my only concern with improving the world is improving myself, or developing a sense of inner calm, then I'm contributing my part to making the world a better place. Is that I'm making myself more calm and more peaceful and less reactive. And that's what I'm trying to make available to everyone else, the tools and the concepts to help people to arrive at that place of having more inner peace.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Noah, for the work that you are contributing to the world.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Well, it was such an honor to speak with you, and I'm so appreciative of your time.
Oh, thank you. And I really appreciate you having me on your podcast. It's always fun to be able to talk about this stuff.
All right, everyone. Well, that is it for today. I really hope that you enjoyed that interview. I'm really so grateful that you took the time to listen. Please remember that this podcast is not a substitute for treatment from a licensed mental health provider or a doctor. And in the show notes, you'll find several national hotlines that can serve as resources and a departure point for getting help. So if you've been in a spot where you are not quite sure what to do or you're not quite sure who to talk to, you can start with the national hotlines. And there are licensed counselors there available to talk to you. They can provide you with resources in your area. I know that taking that first step sometimes can be the hardest one, is just picking up the phone and talking to somebody and sort of acknowledging the fact that you might need help that's outside of yourself, right? Because we're not meant to do this alone. And a lot of times we can't do it alone. So please know that help is available. There's no need to suffer in silence. I will be leaving the titles of Noah's books, so if you're interested in purchasing them, they will be linked, and so you'll be able to check those out. If you liked what you heard today, please, please, please head on over to the iTunes store and leave a review or a rating. It really, really helps other people to find the podcast. And not only that, but I just love hearing from you guys. I love hearing your thoughts about what you heard, and I loved an opportunity to continue the discussion. If there's something that you'd like to know more about or a topic that you'd like me to present about, feel free to email me. My email is tzipporah@innerskytherapeutics.com. That will also be in the notes, and I'm pretty good about responding pretty quickly. You can also connect with me on the various social media platforms. Instagram, I'm at Ancient Tools for Modern Living, and on Facebook, Ancient Tools for Modern Living, the podcast, has its own Facebook page. So that is all for today. I look forward to sharing the next episode with you. And until then, remember that you carry your own power to feel peace and light, connection to whatever divine source you feel connected to, and your own capacity to heal. It's all already inside of you. And I wish you joy in discovering those gifts that you have and sharing them with the world. Namaste.